Deep within the Appalachian Mountains, beauty hides something far darker. Locals whisper of voices calling out from the trees, of figures moving where no human should walk, and of cabins that appear one night and vanish the next. These are not just stories. They are chilling accounts of people who never came back the same, if they came back at all. Tonight we'll step into the shadows of the mountains where the line between the living and the lost disappears. Welcome to Farcical Fears, where every tale pulls you deeper into the unknown. If you're ready to face the darkness, make sure to subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us as we unravel the true unexplained horrors of the Appalachian wild. Let's move to our first story. The hospital stood like a forgotten skeleton at the edge of the mountains, its windows shattered like jagged teeth, and its walls weathered from decades of abandonment. Locals in the nearby town whispered about it, always lowering their voices when its name came up, as if even the echo of it might invite something unwanted into their lives. It had been abandoned for nearly 40 years, after a string of inexplicable deaths among both patients and staff. But the stories of what happened inside continued to grow darker with every telling. The building was nicknamed Hollow Pines Sanatorium, though its official name had long since been erased from public records. It was said that the woods grew differently around it, that the air turned heavy and metallic near the broken gates, and that even birds refused to land on the roof. Ethan Hayes never believed in such things. A 27-year-old freelance photographer, Ethan specialized in abandoned places, often sneaking into forgotten structures to capture their decay. His social media presence was growing, and he prided himself on peeling back the layers of forgotten architecture to find beauty in rot and ruin. When he heard about Hollow Pines, he knew he had to see it for himself. His friends warned him off, repeating the old rumors, patients screaming in the halls long after the building had closed, shadowy figures watching from the windows, voices whispering in empty rooms. But Ethan brushed them aside. Fear, to him, was fuel. The more terrifying the backstory, the more clicks his photos earned. The day he arrived, the sun was setting behind the Appalachian Ridge, painting the forest in crimson light. The gate, too. The hospital grounds was bent and rusted, a skeletal arch that groaned when he pushed it open. His boots sank slightly into the overgrown path leading to the main building, crunching over shards of glass and broken tile. The hospital loomed above him, massive and hollow, its brickwork scarred by years of storms. Ethan paused, lifting his camera and snapping a photo of the facade. The camera clicked, but the sound felt muffled, swallowed by the unnatural stillness of the place. Inside, the air was thick and stale, the kind of suffocating heaviness that smelled faintly of rust, mildew, and something sharp beneath it, like copper. His flashlight beam cut across peeling wallpaper, and rusted gurneys left scattered in the halls. A wheelchair sat tipped over near the entrance, its wheels frozen in place, as if abandoned mid-flight. Ethan took more pictures, adjusting his lens, but every photo he checked seemed darker than the room itself, as though shadows crowded closer each time. As he moved deeper, he found the old patient wings. Names still clung to door placards. There, letters half fused, but a few were disturbingly intact. Room 212, Catherine Morton. Room 213, Daniel Crane. He stopped when his light caught something carved into the wood of one door, not graffiti, not random scratches. The words were deliberate, burned deep into the surface. They never left. His chest tightened, but he laughed nervously and snapped a photo anyway. The silence was broken by a faint shuffle behind him. He spun, flashlight beam trembling across the hallway. Nothing, only dust spiraling through the air. He told himself it was a raccoon, maybe. A stray animal nesting in the decaying halls. But as he turned back, his light revealed something he couldn't dismiss so easily. One of the doors that had been firmly closed was now slightly ajar. Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears as he stepped closer. The door creaked when he pushed it, revealing a patient's room that was still partially intact. A bed frame rusted to the floor, restraints dangling from its sides. A nightstand collapsed in one corner, and on the far wall, in dark brown smears, words written in a frantic "Scroll, help me." His flashlight flickered, and in the half-second of darkness, he swore he saw someone sitting on the bed, a gaunt figure hunched forward, head bent at an unnatural angle. When the beam steadied again, the bed was empty. Ethan's throat tightened. He lowered the camera, his hands shaking. Suddenly aware of how loud his own breathing sounded in the silence, he wanted to leave. But something compelled him to keep going. It wasn't just the desire for photos anymore. It was the building itself. The deeper he went, the stronger the pull became, as though invisible hands were guiding him forward. He descended a flight of stairs into the basement, the temperature dropping with each step. The air grew damp, carrying the acrid stench of mold and something older, rotting. The basement was darker than anywhere else, his flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. He swept it across the room and froze. Along the far wall were rows of morgue drawers, their metal doors streaked with rust. Some hung slightly open, as if whatever lay inside had tried to push its way out. Ethan's hand trembled as he lifted his camera, snapping photo after photo. The flash lit the room in bursts, and in each burst he saw something different. First, empty drawers. Second, hands pressing from inside the steel. Third, pale faces with hollow eyes, their mouths stretched in silent screams. The fourth. Flash showed nothing again, only metal. But Ethan could no longer breathe. His body screamed to flee, yet his legs felt rooted to the floor. A whisper curled through the dark, low and ragged. "Stay with us." He stumbled backward, dropping his camera. The sound of it shattering echoed too loudly, reverberating through the basement like a scream. That whisper turned into a chorus, dozens of voices overlapping, some crying, some laughing, some chanting words he couldn't understand. The morgue drawers rattled violently, metal clanging as if fists were pounding from the inside. Ethan bolted for the stairs, his flashlight swinging wildly, but halfway up, he froze. A figure stood at the top of the staircase, thin, in a patient's gown, its head cocked to the side, its eyes reflecting his light like an animal's. He staggered back, nearly falling down the steps, when the figure whispered again, "Don't leave us." You opened the door. In a blind panic, he shoved past it, or tried to. His shoulder hit something solid, and icy cold spread through his body like liquid nitrogen. He forced himself up the stairs, bursting into the first floor. His chest heaved, his vision blurred, and yet he kept running. Hallways twisted in ways they hadn't before, doors leading into dead ends. The hospital was changing, reshaping itself around him. He knew then he was trapped, hours later, or minutes. He couldn't tell anymore. Ethan stumbled into the main lobby. The broken wheelchair was gone. The front doors stood open, showing the dark forest beyond. He sprinted through them, gasping for air as he collapsed onto the overgrown path outside. But when he looked back, the hospital was gone. Behind him stretched only endless trees, the path winding into nothing. Hollow Pines had swallowed itself whole, and Ethan realized with dawning horror that he hadn't escaped at all. He was still inside, a new patient added to its walls. Another whisper in the chorus. From that night on, locals swore they saw a young man's face in the windows of Hollow Pines, camera hanging from his neck, eyes wide and pleading. The sanatorium had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before. And still, when the wind carried right, the words carved into the door echoed through the halls. They never left. Let's move to our second story. The town of Coldwater Hollow had long been shrouded in uneasy whispers, a place tucked deep within the Appalachian woods where the mist seemed thicker, the nights colder, and the silence sharper than anywhere else. Outsiders rarely ventured there, and those who did often claimed the forest pressed against them with an almost physical weight, as if unseen eyes observed from every direction. Among the oldest structures in town was the Coldwater Hollow School, a squat brick building abandoned in the 1960s after a string of tragedies that locals rarely spoke about. Its windows were boarded, its roof sagged under years of neglect. Yet children dared each other to approach it, and adults lowered their voices whenever the subject came up. It was, said the last principal, Mr. Alden Cross, never left the school. Some whispered that he had been cruel, others that he had gone mad after the deaths of several children in a mysterious fire that consumed the West Wing. All anyone agreed on was that the school was cursed. And yet, on a stormy night in October, a group of 4 amateur urban explorers arrived at Coldwater Hollow with cameras, microphones, and the cocky confidence of those who believed fear was only in the mind. They called themselves Forgotten Shadows, a small but growing YouTube channel that thrived on venturing into forgotten buildings. There was Ethan, the de facto leader with a stubborn streak. Leah, his girlfriend, and the most cautious of the group. Marcus, who laughed at everything, even when it wasn't funny. And Claire, who documented everything with quiet fascination. That night, they parked just outside the overgrown schoolyard, their headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. The storm had driven most townsfolk indoors, but even if someone had seen them, nobody would have dared to stop them. The school was a place better left alone. As they forced open the rusted front doors, the air that greeted them was heavy with mildew and rot. Their flashlights cut swaths of pale light across crumbling hallways, collapsed ceilings, and graffiti-covered walls. But beneath the layers of vandalism, traces of its original life clung stubbornly faded children's drawings. Broken chalkboards with long-forgotten lessons scrawled in yellow chalk, and the faint scent of burnt wood that lingered decades. After the fire, Leah shivered as they entered what had once been the assembly hall. Rows of broken chairs stretched before them, and at the far end, a toppled podium lay in the dust. She whispered, "It feels wrong in here." Marcus snorted and set his camera rolling. That's the point. Creepy cells. But as they moved deeper into the school, the oppressive stillness began to gnaw at their bravado. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though someone or something followed just a beat behind them. At first they brushed it off as nerves, but then the whisper started. Soft, indistinct voices carried down the hallways, too faint to make out, but impossible to ignore. Ethan stopped suddenly, raising his hand. "Do you hear that?" Leah nodded, her face pale. Claire, gripping her recorder, murmured, "It sounds like children." They stood in silence, the storm outside muted by thick brick walls. For a moment, the whispers ceased. Then, from somewhere above them, came the unmistakable sound of laughter high-pitched, brittle, and terribly wrong. Marcus, trying to shake off the unease, laughed nervously. Somebody probably left a speaker in here. Urban legend bait. But his voice cracked, betraying his own fear. Against better judgment, they climbed the stairwell toward the second floor, each step groaning under their weight. The air grew colder, their breaths fogging in front of their faces despite the warmth of the storm outside. At the top of the stairs, they found a long hallway lined with classrooms, each door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-dash scream. In the first classroom, broken desks and chairs lay scattered across the floor, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. But at the chalkboard, someone had scrawled fresh words in jagged white strokes. "Stay with us." Leah backed away instantly. "That wasn't here before," she whispered. Ethan knelt, brushing the chalk with his finger. It smudged easily, still soft. His voice was low and tense. "This is new." As if on cue, the laughter returned, this time behind them. They spun around, but the hallway was empty. Marcus, his bravado crumbling, muttered, "This isn't funny anymore." The group pressed on, driven partly by fear, partly by the stubborn need to prove themselves. But the deeper they went, the stranger the school became. Doors that had once been open were suddenly closed. The hallways seemed to stretch longer than they should. Claire's recorder picked up whispers the others couldn't hear. Fragmented phrases like "don't leave" and "still burning." It was in the old library, where they found the first undeniable proof that something was wrong. Dust-covered shelves stood, like gravestones, their books rotting with age. In the center of the room sat a circle of small chairs, each one perfectly arranged as though waiting for children to return. And on one chair lay a melted wax candle, still warm, its flame recently extinguished. Leah's hand shook as she whispered, "Who lit this?" Before anyone could answer, every chair scraped loudly against the floor, as if invisible children had risen to their feet. The explorers screamed, bolting back into the hallway. But instead of the stairwell, they found themselves in yet another, unfamiliar corridor, one that none of them remembered passing. The walls here were scorched black, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke. Claire realized with horror that they had stepped into the burned wing of the school section that had been sealed off since the fire, yet here they were, trapped inside it. Charred beams jutted like broken bones from the ceiling, and the faint crackle of phantom flames echoed in the distance. And then they saw him, at the end of the corridor. Half shrouded in darkness, stood a tall man in a soot-stained suit. His face was obscured, but his posture was rigid, commanding. Slowly, he lifted a hand and pointed directly at them. "Run," Ethan hissed. They did, tearing through the hallways, the school twisting around them like a maze. Doors slammed shut in their faces, windows rattled violently, and the whispers rose to a deafening cacophony. "Stay with us. Stay with us." Leah tripped, crashing into a classroom. Ethan grabbed her, but froze when he saw what was inside. The room was filled with rows of desks, and in each one sat the charred outline of a child, blackened figures frozen in the moment of death, their hollow eye sockets glowing faintly in the dark. The explorers stumbled back, but the door slammed shut behind them. The figures began to move, turning their heads slowly toward the intruders. Their mouths opened, releasing a chorus of agonized screams that rattled the very walls. Claire dropped her recorder in terror, but it continued playing, looping a single phrase in a child's voice. "He never let us leave." Through the haze of smoke and shadow, the tall man appeared once more, his face now visible. It was Alden Cross, the long-dead principal, his features warped by burns, his eyes burning with a cruel hunger. His voice was a guttural growl. "Class is still in session." One by one, the explorers were dragged into the darkness, their screams joining the chorus of the damned. When the storm passed and dawn broke over Coldwater Hollow, the school stood silent once more. To anyone passing by, it was just another ruin, forgotten and decaying. But if you listened closely, you could hear them, the faint echo of laughter, the scrape of tiny chairs, and the relentless voice of Alden Cross, forever keeping his students inside the Forgotten Shadows channel, never uploaded again. Their cameras were found weeks later, scattered in the woods. The footage was corrupted, nothing but static. Yet some claimed that, if you played it in complete silence, you could just make out the sound of children laughing. And in Coldwater Hollow, the school still waits. Let's move to our third story, a tale rooted deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where mist curls through the valleys like ghostly fingers, and forgotten histories hide beneath the soil. This story is whispered in local bars and around late-night campfires. A story that no one can fully prove, but no one dares to deny. They call it the Watcher in the Pines, and those who live near the mountains swear it is not just folklore, but something real that has stalked their families for generations. It begins with a small town named Black Hollow, tucked against the ridge where endless pines grow so thick they blot out the sun, even at midday. For centuries, locals avoided a stretch of forest known simply as the Hollow Pines, claiming that it was cursed. Old miners refused to dig beneath it, loggers avoided felling trees there, and children who wandered too close sometimes never returned. Yet the government, in its hunger for resources, ignored the warnings and tried to clear land for new development in the 1970s. That's when things went wrong. The first to vanish was a surveyor named Daniel Ross. He was tasked with mapping the terrain and marking boundaries for construction, but after he entered the Hollow Pines, he never came back. His truck was found parked by the trail, equipment still inside, but there was no trace of him. Search parties combed the woods for days, but all they found was his hard hat hanging from a tree branch 20 feet above the ground. Locals whispered that the Watcher had claimed him, and soon the project was abandoned. The Hollow Pines grew thicker, darker, and more feared with each passing year. In 2011, a young documentary filmmaker named Emily Carter arrived in Black Hollow. She had grown up on horror stories about the Appalachians, but unlike most, she wasn't scared. She was fascinated. Her specialty was uncovering folklore and tracing it back to its roots, separating myth from reality. When she heard about the Watcher in the Pines, she immediately sensed it could be her greatest work yet. She planned a small film crew, just herself and two friends, Ryan and Marcus, to explore the Hollow Pines and document whatever they found. From the moment they set foot on the trail, something felt off. The forest was unnaturally silent. No birds, no insects, no sound except the crunch of their boots. Ryan joked nervously that maybe even the animals knew better than to live here, but no one laughed. Emily began recording her narration, speaking into her camera about the legend. A figure taller than any man, cloaked in shadows, with eyes like burning coals that glowed between the trees. Locals said it didn't hunt for food. Instead, it watched, always watching. Those who returned from the hollow pines spoke of the sensation of eyes boring into them, and sometimes they carried home something far worse: obsession, nightmares that drove them to madness, or a shadow that followed them for the rest of their lives. The first night in the forest was uneventful. They pitched their tent near an abandoned logging road, ate canned food, and recorded interviews by flashlight. Emily asked Ryan and Marcus if they believed in the Watcher. Ryan shrugged, saying it was just mountain superstition. Marcus was less certain. He admitted he'd grown up in a rural part of Virginia, and had heard similar stories about forest men and tree watchers. He didn't know if it was real, but he knew one thing: the Appalachians were older than civilization, and sometimes old things don't like to be disturbed. It was the second night when the first signs appeared. They heard branches cracking in the distance, heavy footfalls too big for a deer, too deliberate for a bear. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the trees, but the beam seemed swallowed by the dark. Then came the whistling, a low drawn-out sound, almost like a person trying to mimic birdsong, but warped, distorted, echoing unnaturally between the trunks. Marcus froze. "That's not an animal," he whispered. None of them slept well that night. By the third day, they were jumpy, exhausted, and yet Emily pressed on, determined to capture something undeniable. They followed the old road deeper into the hollow pines, where they stumbled upon the remnants of a cabin. The wood was rotted, the roof caved in, but inside they found strange markings carved into the wall, circles with slashes through them, spirals that led nowhere, and a single phrase scratched again and again: "He sees." Emily recorded everything, exhilarated, but Marcus grew pale. He refused to step inside, claiming the air felt wrong, heavy, like they were trespassing in a place that wasn't meant to be touched. That night, things escalated. Around 2 a.m., Emily woke to the sound of movement just outside the tent. She reached for her camera and quietly unzipped the flap. Through the viewfinder, she caught a glimpse of something tall standing between the pines. It wasn't fully visible, just a silhouette, impossibly thin, with limbs too long to be human. Its head turned slowly toward her, and though she couldn't see details, she swore she saw 2 red glints in the dark. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't scream, didn't move. She just kept recording. After what felt like an eternity, the shape stepped backward and melted into the shadows. The next morning, she showed the footage to Ryan and Marcus. Ryan swore it was a trick of the camera, a shadow. Marcus wasn't so sure. "You should delete it," he said firmly. "Whatever that thing is, it doesn't want to be filmed." Emily refused. This was proof, finally, undeniable proof, that something was in the hollow pines. She vowed they'd stay until they had more, but staying was a mistake. On the 4th day, Ryan went missing. He'd gone to fetch water from a nearby stream, and when Emily and Marcus followed the trail, they found his canteen on the bank. But no Ryan. His footprints led into the trees, but after 20 feet, they stopped. Not faded, not scattered, as if he had vanished mid-step. They called his name for hours, but the forest gave nothing back except silence. That night, the whistling returned, louder now. Circling the camp, Marcus was unraveling, whispering that the Watcher had taken Ryan and would take them too. Emily tried to stay strong, but fear was gnawing at her resolve. She couldn't shake the feeling that every time she lifted her camera, something was looking right back at her from behind the lens. The final night came in a storm. Thunder cracked above the trees, rain pounded the earth, and through the flashes of lightning, Emily saw the Watcher, standing less than 50 feet away, tall, gaunt, with a face like a hollow mask and eyes burning faint red. It didn't move, it just stared. Marcus screamed and bolted into the forest, vanishing into the dark. Emily was alone. She aimed her camera at the figure, but when the next lightning strike illuminated the trees, it was gone. The last footage on Emily's camera was found weeks later by a search team. The tent was shredded, equipment scattered, but no trace of Emily, Ryan, or Marcus was ever found. The camera lay half buried in mud near the stream. Its final recording showed Emily's terrified face whispering, "It's right behind me." Then static. To this day, hikers and hunters near Black Hollow still report strange happenings in the hollow pines. They speak of being watched, of hearing unnatural whistling between the trees, and of finding footprints that don't belong to any known animal. The watcher, they say, is still there waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far. Let's move to our fourth story, a tale whispered in hushed tones across the Appalachian towns. A story that clings to the memory of anyone who dares step foot near the ridge known as Raven's Hollow, where time itself feels stretched thin, and the air is heavier than it should be, as though the mountain is breathing slowly and watching every intruder who trespasses. And it all began with a man named Samuel, a retired fireman who carried scars both on his body and in his heart, hoping to find peace in the solitude of the mountains, far from the chaos of the city. But what he found instead was an ancient silence that did not welcome him, a silence that pressed against his ears and filled his lungs with dread. And when he purchased a small run-down cabin near the edge of the hollow, the locals offered him only warnings, not congratulations, muttering phrases like, "Don't stay past dusk," and the hollow remembers cryptic remarks that Samuel dismissed as backwoods superstition until the first night when he noticed the sound of children laughing in the woods, even though no one lived within miles of his property. Laughter that carried no warmth but instead rang sharp and hollow like glass scraping against stone. And when he stepped onto his porch to investigate, the laughter stopped abruptly, leaving only the rush of wind through the branches. Yet when he turned to go back inside, he saw muddy footprints on his porch, small as though left by a child, but pressed deep enough into the wood to belong to something heavier. And the prints trailed to his door, but never away from it. And though he tried to sleep, the weight of those prints pressed against his mind like a hand closing around his throat, forcing him to dream of shadowed children standing at the tree line, their faces blank and their eyes wide, watching, always watching. And each morning he told himself he imagined it, yet each morning he woke to new footprints that circled his cabin, pressing deeper into the soft soil as though something had spent the entire night walking round and round, wearing a path into the earth. And after days of this relentless haunting, Samuel began to notice the woods themselves seemed to shift when he walked into them. Trails that once led north now bent sharply into unfamiliar directions, tree trunks repeating like endless mirrors, moss-covered rocks appearing in places they hadn't been the day before, as though the hollow refused to let him go further, or perhaps was luring him deeper into its heart. And it was on the 10th night, when storms rolled across the mountains, that he awoke to the distinct sound of knocking on his door, soft at first, rhythmic and deliberate, and when he whispered to himself, "Who's there?" the knocking answered with 3 slow raps, as though mocking him, and when he dared to open the door, the forest stared back, empty, dark, yet filled with a terrible presence. And that is when he saw them clearly for the first time, figures in the woods, not children but something else, their bodies crooked and too thin, their movements jittery, as if bones shifted wrong beneath the skin, and their mouths stretched into unnatural smiles that split too wide across their faces. And though their forms vanished with each flash of lightning, Samuel could feel their eyes boring into him, red glints in the black. And the storm raged until morning, tearing branches from trees and flooding the paths. Yet when daylight came, the damage was not just natural, for his porch bore fresh carvings, symbols jagged and raw, spirals and eyes and figures of stretched bodies, etched into the wood with precision too exact for random vandalism. And Samuel, who had faced fires that consumed entire buildings, who had carried lifeless bodies in his arms, who had stood against death itself in his years of service, trembled like a child because he knew this was not madness, this was not the paranoia of solitude, this was the hollow speaking, warning, or claiming him. And he thought of leaving, packing what little he owned into his truck. But when he turned the key in the ignition, the vehicle refused to start. And the reflection in the cracked side mirror did not show him, but instead one of those grinning, thin-bodied figures standing behind him, though when he whipped around, the back of the truck was empty, and with no escape, he tried to endure, surviving each day with dwindling strength, while at night the laughter grew louder, echoing inside the cabin as though the walls themselves had been hollowed into throats that whispered and cackled. And Samuel began writing journals, desperate to anchor his sanity, scribbling every symbol, every sound, every hallucination that may not have been hallucination at all. And in those final entries, the words spiraled into desperate repetition. They want me, the hollow remembers, and on the last page, a single phrase written over and over and shaking hands. I am part of the hollow now. And that was the end of Samuel, as anyone knew him. For the cabin was later discovered, abandoned, dishes still on the table, his journals scattered across the floor, muddy footprints circling endlessly around the house like a ritual path. But no trace of Samuel himself, and when search parties scoured Raven's Hollow, they swore the woods bent against them. Compasses spinning wildly, radios going dead, trails leading them back to where they began, and some refused to return, whispering that they saw thin smiling figures weaving between the pines, just out of reach. And though the state closed the search within weeks, the locals never needed the reports, for they already knew what the hollow does. It does not let go. It remembers, it waits, and those who trespass do not return the same, if at all. And to this day, hikers speak of laughter in the distance, where no children could ever be, of muddy footprints on clean trails, of whispers carried on the wind that sound like voices calling them deeper, always deeper, until the forest swallows them whole. Just as it swallowed Samuel, just as it will swallow the next who dares ignore the warnings, because Raven's Hollow has no end and no mercy, it only hungers. Let's move to our fifth story, a tale that lingers along the shadowed valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, whispered among loggers, hunters, and those who drive the lonely roads late at night. A story called The Lantern of Hollow Creek, which begins with a young couple, Mark and Lydia, who moved to a small, forgotten town seeking solitude, unaware that the surrounding forest had teeth, and that even the rivers carried warnings in their current. They had heard the old stories, murmurs of travelers disappearing along Hollow Creek, of lights seen floating over the water, beckoning the curious to follow them into the mist. But they had laughed it off as superstition, as the kind of tale meant to keep children close to home, until the first night in their cabin, when they noticed a faint, flickering glow across the creek, just beyond the tree line, a warm yellow light, swaying gently, as if caught in the wind. But with no lantern in sight, and when Mark called out to ask if Lydia could see it, she froze, her eyes wide, whispering that she felt it was calling them, and the next morning, curiosity pulled them closer. The creek running cold and clear, the fog rolling along the banks like pale ghosts. And as they walked along the muddy path, they found a trail of small footprints, leading into the forest, unlike any animal they had ever seen, delicate, yet deliberate. And though the footprints vanished after a few dozen steps, the glow returned at dusk, drifting along the creek like it was waiting for them, and nights became worse, with whispers curling along the water, unintelligible murmurs that sounded almost human, sometimes beckoning them, sometimes laughing, teasing, filling their minds with a dread that settled deep into their bones. Until one evening, Mark followed the lantern, deeper into the woods, Lydia's frantic cries echoing behind him, but the light slipped further ahead, always just out of reach, drawing him toward a section of Hollow Creek that the locals called Dead Man's Bend, where the river twisted sharply and the trees pressed close together, forming a corridor of shadow. And as he approached the bend, the lantern floated closer, revealing the faint outline of a figure holding it, impossibly tall and thin, its face hidden beneath a tattered hood, glowing faintly from within, like the light itself emanated from its chest. And Mark froze, the air thick, smelling of decay and wet earth, and the figure raised a hand, beckoning, and he felt his legs move forward as though hypnotized, every step heavier than the last, until he tripped on a root and fell. And the lantern drifted above him, illuminating the forest floor in patches of gold, revealing other figures emerging from the shadows, smaller than the first, their faces pale and expressionless, moving with uncanny stillness, surrounding him in silence. And the whispers grew louder, overlapping, as though the forest itself were speaking through them, and when Mark tried to call for Lydia, his voice was drowned out by the crescendo of murmurs, a melody of voices blending into a hum that vibrated through his chest, shaking him to the core, until the largest figure bent closer, and he realized with paralyzing fear that its hands were wrapped in chains that rattled softly with each movement, and the chains were attached to lanterns, all floating and swaying, casting distorted shadows across the trees, forming grotesque patterns that seemed to reach for him. And the first figure spoke, though the sound was not words, but a vibration in his mind. A message clear in its intent. You should not have come. And as he struggled to stand, the smaller figures advanced, their feet barely making contact with the ground, gliding silently, eyes glinting like polished bone, and Mark turned desperately to run. But the forest had changed. Paths he knew were gone, twisted into impossible shapes, and the creek seemed to stretch farther away, as if mocking his efforts. And when he glanced back, Lydia was not at the cabin, nor calling for him, but standing at the edge of the bend, her eyes wide and unblinking, pale light reflecting off her skin, and she raised her arms as if to warn him, or perhaps to offer him to the lantern bearers, and terror gripped him as he realized she no longer moved like his wife, but like a puppet, controlled by the same unseen force guiding the lantern. And then a cold wind ripped through the trees, extinguishing the moon and stars, and for a moment, only the golden light of the floating lanterns illuminated the hollow creek, revealing a pit in the riverbank, filled with water, dark as oil, reflecting the distorted faces of the figures above. And as Mark approached, drawn by a force he could not resist, the largest figure reached down and touched his shoulder, the chill of its touch sinking into his marrow, and he saw his own reflection in the water. Not his face, but twisted, hollow-eyed, grinning back at him, and a scream tore from his throat, swallowed immediately by the whispers. And when he opened his eyes, he was no longer on the riverbank, but inside the cabin, drenched, trembling, with the lantern gone, and the creek silent, as if it had never existed. And Lydia sat beside the fireplace, pale but seemingly normal, holding a cup of tea, whispering softly that everything was fine. And for a moment he believed it, until he saw the faint glow outside the window, drifting toward the woods again, beckoning. And he realized that Hollow Creek had marked them, and the lantern would return, and with it, the whispers, the figures, and the endless pull into the forest. And over the following nights, the couple noticed subtle changes. Doors slightly ajar when they knew they closed them, footprints appearing in the mud outside in patterns they had not walked, objects inside the cabin rearranged, always forming strange shapes, spirals, or crude human forms. And sometimes, at dusk, Mark swore he heard a faint melody, a lullaby carried from the creek, sung by unseen voices, coaxing him toward the trees, calling him to follow the lantern again, promising a vision of the impossible, a place of light and warmth, if only he would step past the threshold. And Lydia began to speak in her sleep of strange things, telling him about floating islands of light, of men wrapped in chains, of rivers that twisted infinitely. And the more she spoke, the more Mark felt their reality blur with the Hollow Creek, as if the boundary between forest and home had dissolved, leaving them trapped in a liminal space that twisted with each flicker of the lantern. And when the townspeople passed their cabin, they noted the windows glowing faintly at night, amber light drifting across the lawn in patterns too perfect to be natural, and some swore they saw the couple standing at the edge of the woods, staring silently into the mist, until the lantern rose above them like a beacon, guiding the shadows through the trees, a warning to any who would wander too close. And the legend of Hollow Creek continued to grow, whispered in taverns, written in journals, carried on the wind along the Appalachian roads, that those who see the lantern are forever changed, drawn toward the unseen. And though the couple remains alive, they are no longer wholly themselves, part of the creek's memory now, marked by the lantern, haunted by floating lights and shadowed figures, reminders that curiosity in the hollow valleys of the Appalachians can cost everything, and that sometimes the forest waits patiently, keeping the stories alive for the next unwary traveler who dares follow the flickering glow into the dark. Let's move to our sixth story, a chilling legend from the Appalachian Mountains known to the locals as the Whispering Ascent, which begins with a group of college friends Alex, Jenna, and Thomas deciding to hike an abandoned trail called Hollow ridge a path that had once led to a small mining settlement before it was mysteriously deserted in the early 1900s. And though the locals warned them of the voices that haunted the mountains, claiming that anyone who strayed off the main trail could hear whispers that compelled them to wander into the forest forever, the friends dismissed these warnings as superstition and arrived on a crisp autumn morning with backpacks and excitement, eager for adventure. But as they stepped onto the ridge, a dense fog rolled over the peaks, swallowing the path and muting all sounds except the crunch of their boots against fallen leaves. And soon Alex noticed the first whisper, soft and indistinct, like someone speaking directly into his mind, repeating fragments of words that seemed almost familiar, calling his name, though no one else could hear it. And when he pointed it out, Jenna laughed nervously, saying the wind was probably playing tricks, but Thomas admitted he heard it too, faint and melodic, like the laughter of children far away. And the whispers grew stronger as they ascended, weaving through the trees, coaxing them off the main trail. And when Alex looked back, he realized the valley below was vanishing in the fog, the trail behind them no longer recognizable, and the forest around them seemed to pulse with a subtle heartbeat, each step heavier than the last, as though the mountain itself had begun guiding them toward something unseen, yet compelling. And by late afternoon, they stumbled across the ruins of the old mining settlement, buildings reduced to rotting timbers and rusted equipment, and the fog clung to the structures like spectral hands, concealing the details and amplifying the silence. And it was then that the voices shifted in tone, from calling their names to murmuring warnings, urging them to leave, yet strangely, at the same time, drawing them deeper into the abandoned cabins and collapsed tunnels. And inside one of the mine entrances, they found crude symbols etched into the walls, spirals and intersecting lines, with strange marks resembling human eyes staring from the stone. And when Alex tried to photograph the symbols with his phone, the screen went black, then flickered to reveal brief glimpses of shadowy figures moving just beyond his vision. Figures with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to stretch and warp in impossible ways. And Jenna, trembling, whispered that she felt watched, as if every breath they took, every movement, was being observed by a presence older than the forest itself. And the wind began to carry voices that sounded like the miners of old, telling tales of accidents, betrayals, and something lurking beneath the earth, waiting for those who dared trespass. And though the friends tried to leave, they realized the trail behind had disappeared, replaced by an endless stretch of gnarled roots and thick trees, twisting in directions that defied logic. And every time they called out to one another, the echoes returned, distorted, speaking their fears aloud, reflecting their own dread back at them. And night fell quickly, shadows stretching impossibly long, the fog thickening into a wall around them. And it was in the deepest darkness that the whispers became voices. Distinct now, repeating phrases in voices that were not theirs, but somehow intimately familiar, recounting their secrets, their past mistakes, their deepest fears. And Thomas, panic-stricken, ran toward a faint light in the distance, only to vanish between the trees, his screams swallowed instantly by the fog, leaving Alex and Jenna paralyzed with fear. And as they searched for him, the ground beneath their feet began to pulse, and the forest seemed to breathe in synchronization with the whispers, every step bringing them closer to a cavern entrance that appeared where none had existed before, carved into the side of the ridge, dark and yawning, exuding a chill so severe it burned their lungs. And the light they had followed flickered and revealed a figure inside the cavern, tall, cloaked in shadows, face hidden, with eyes that glowed faintly orange, holding a lantern that cast impossible patterns on the walls. And the whispers now were a cacophony, urging surrender, promising safety if only they entered. And Jenna, trembling, grabbed Alex, urging him to run. But the pull of the forest and the figure was too strong, their steps sluggish, bodies heavy, minds clouded with unease. And as they entered the cavern, the temperature dropped further, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. And inside, the walls of the cavern were covered in more symbols, hundreds of them, pulsating faintly, as if alive. And shadows moved in the corners of their vision, figures that existed only when they looked indirectly. And when Alex raised his camera, the screen revealed not the cavern but endless faces pressed against darkness, whispering, screaming, crying, imploring. And the lantern figure beckoned them deeper, until the path opened into a vast underground chamber, illuminated by dozens of lanterns suspended in midair, glowing orange, each lantern casting shadows of thin, elongated figures walking silently along the walls and ceiling. And in the center of the chamber was a pit, black and unfathomable, from which the whispers seemed strongest, echoing through their minds, telling them to jump, to join the others, to surrender to the hollow mountain. And as the chamber pulsed with whispers, Jenna fell to her knees, paralyzed with terror, while Alex realized the figures were not merely shadows but spirits trapped long ago. Miners and trespassers alike, their forms twisted, eyes wide and hollow, chained to the lanterns, guiding the unwary to the pit. And when he tried to drag Jenna away, one of the figures reached out, impossibly fast, cold as death, brushing her shoulder. And the world seemed to tilt, their balance lost. And suddenly Alex was alone, Jenna gone, her screams now part of the cacophony of whispers, echoing endlessly in the cavern. And panic surged through him, legs moving on their own, dragged forward by the invisible pull of the pit, until the lantern figure descended from above, looming over him, voice vibrating in his mind. All who ascend hear the whispers. All who hear belong. And Alex felt his knees buckle, mind fraying, as the whispers merged with his thoughts, memories of his life blending with memories that were not his, until he could not tell where he ended and the mountain began. And when dawn broke over Hollow Ridge, searchers found an abandoned backpack, a camera still recording static, and no sign of the friends, only faint echoes of voices carried on the wind, whispers warning anyone else who dared approach that the Hollow Ridge keeps its own, that the mountain itself remembers, and that those who hear the whispers are never truly free. Only part of the forest, part of the ridge, part of a story that continues to unfold in the shadows of the Appalachians, waiting for the next souls foolish enough to listen and follow. Let's move to our seventh story. A terrifying tale known among the Appalachian locals as the Hollow Man of Blue Ridge. A legend that begins with Ethan, a wildlife photographer who had traveled from the city seeking solitude and pristine landscapes in the remote peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, drawn by reports of untouched forests and the haunting beauty of mist-covered valleys. And though he intended to spend only a week camping alone, the locals at the nearest town warned him about the Hollow Man, a figure said to haunt the ridges, tall, emaciated, eyes black as coal, appearing silently at the edge of vision. Never seen directly, but always present to those who lingered too long. Warnings he dismissed with a polite smile and a shrug, believing them to be nothing more than superstition. But as soon as he entered the forest, he felt an unsettling weight in the air, a silence that pressed against him, muting bird calls and rustling leaves. And on the second night, while reviewing his photographs by the campfire, he noticed a figure captured in one of the shots, standing at the edge of a clearing, impossibly tall and thin, with dark hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly through the lens. Yet when he looked up, nothing was there except the trees swaying in the wind. And each night thereafter, he began to notice movement at the periphery of his vision. Shadows too straight and elongated to be natural, always retreating when he tried to focus on them. And the temperature around him would drop suddenly, his breath visible even on warm nights, as though the Hollow Man exhaled cold from the forest itself. And on the fourth night, the whispers began, subtle at first, like wind over leaves, yet carrying tones that were unmistakably human, hissing threats, repeating his name, describing his thoughts and memories he had never spoken aloud. And Ethan realized the Hollow Man was not just watching, but probing, feeding on fear, understanding him in a way no human ever could. And when he tried to hike back to the town for help, the trail seemed to twist unnaturally, the same boulders and trees appearing over and over, no matter how far he ran, as though the mountain had reshaped itself around him, guiding him deeper into its heart. And the nights became unbearable, filled with the sound of whispers and footfalls that never reached the ground, faint and rapid, circling the tent in patterns that made his stomach churn. And one evening, as a thick fog rolled down the ridges, Ethan ventured to a small stream to get water, only to find footprints lining the banks. Enormous, thin, human-like, yet grotesquely elongated, disappearing into the mist, and he followed them against his better judgment, compelled by an almost hypnotic force, until he reached a clearing where the fog hung heavy, and the trees seemed to bend away, forming a natural archway that he could not resist walking through. And beyond the arch was a hollow in the mountainside, dark and yawning, and inside, shapes shifted in the darkness, figures with skeletal frames, their eyes glowing faintly red, moving in ways that defied physics, and Ethan realized with terror that he was not seeing them as much as feeling them. Their presence embedding itself into his mind, seeping into his senses, warping his perception, and the whispers grew into a roar, echoing in the hollows of his skull, repeating phrases of ownership and inevitability. You belong here. You are ours. And he tried to flee, but the forest behind him had vanished, replaced by jagged rock faces and twisted roots. Each step heavier, his legs resisting, as if bound by invisible chains, and the hollow man emerged, taller than any human, black eyes absorbing all light, mouth a slit of endless darkness, standing motionless yet radiating a force that pushed Ethan to his knees. And as the man extended a hand, the surrounding shadows began to coalesce into faceless figures, encircling him, and he realized that they were previous victims. Trapped in the mountain, their forms twisted, silent, chained to the hollow man's will, unable to speak, unable to move freely, forced to watch as the next trespasser arrived. And the air vibrated with a chorus of their silent screams, filling the hollow with an oppressive dread, and Ethan's camera, which he had clutched to his chest, fell to the ground, the images displayed briefly flickering, showing glimpses of his own face, warped, eyes hollow, mouth stretched in a silent scream, before the screen went black. And when he looked up, the hollow man was closer, impossibly close, yet not moving, an impossibility that his mind struggled to reconcile. And then Ethan felt the cold touch of skeletal fingers pressing against his shoulder, a chill that burned through him, and he heard the voice again, now distinct, resonant in his mind. You are part of the mountain now, and his knees buckled, body frozen, mind fraying, memories and fears blending with the whispers, until he could no longer distinguish himself from the forest, the hollow, or the hollow man, and the night stretched endlessly, stars above, obscured by fog, the forest breathing in unison with the figure, pulsing as if alive, and Ethan's cries dissolved into the chorus of the trapped, joining the countless who had come before. And when morning came, hikers passing through the ridge found the tent empty, supplies untouched, footprints leading away into the fog, but no sign of Ethan, only whispers carried on the wind, warning those who dared listen that the hollow man waits for all who linger too long, that the Blue Ridge remembers, and that some mountains are alive, hungry, and patient, waiting for the next visitor to trespass and become part of its hollow, part of its eternal whispering. Let's move to our 8th story, a horrifying tale whispered among the Appalachian locals as the Bloodwood Tree, which begins with Mara, a young botanist fascinated by rare plant species, who ventured deep into the forgotten valleys of the Appalachians to study a supposedly extinct tree known only in legend for its blood-red sap, a tree said to grow in isolation, far from trails, and protected by an aura of malice. And though the locals warned her that those who sought the bloodwood never returned, speaking of shadows that clung to intruders and voices that mimicked loved ones, Mara dismissed the tales as superstition, convinced the stories were exaggerations of the forest's natural dangers. And on her first night, she set up camp near a small creek, her equipment scattered. The smell of damp earth and moss thick in the air, yet the forest seemed unusually quiet, a silence that pressed against her ears and made her feel watched. And as she adjusted her notes, she noticed a faint red glow in the distance, which she initially assumed to be a reflection from her lantern, but as the glow pulsed rhythmically, it seemed to beckon her forward, and with each step toward it, the whispers began, soft at first, like wind through the leaves, but gradually forming words she recognized, calling her name, speaking in voices of her mother, her father, voices from her childhood she hadn't heard in years, compelling her deeper into the forest. And when she reached a small clearing, the glow resolved into the bloodwood itself, a grotesque, twisted tree with bark like dried blood, its branches curling unnaturally, red sap dripping like thick tears. And Mara felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the tree itself exhaled a presence older than the forest, older than any living thing. And as she circled it to examine her specimens, shadows detached themselves from the trunks of surrounding trees, forming indistinct humanoid shapes, silent but watching, their eyes hollow, reflecting the crimson glow of the bloodwood. And she realized that the whispers weren't outside her head anymore, they were inside, repeating her fears aloud, recounting moments of doubt, guilt, and shame she had buried for years, twisting them into commands, urging her to climb the roots, touch the sap, consume the tree, as though it hungered for her submission. And despite her rational mind screaming to flee, her body moved forward, compelled by an invisible force. And when her hands touched the red bark, the whispers intensified, now a chorus of thousands, chanting in unison, voices of every person lost in the forest for centuries. Every trespasser who had sought the bloodwood, their cries of pain blending with laughter, forming a symphony of terror. And the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, alive, as if the tree's roots had extended into the soil itself, seeking her essence, drawing her life slowly into its body. And she felt the sap climbing her arms, sticky and hot, coursing through her veins as if the bloodwood were merging with her, rewriting her being, erasing her identity. And from the shadows emerged figures of those who had fallen before. Pale, emaciated, limbs twisted, their mouths open in silent screams, yet their eyes glowed faintly red, mirrored in the bloodwood sap, beckoning her to join them in the eternal forest. And as the night deepened, the forest around her shifted, trees bending to form corridors that led nowhere, the creek twisting impossibly, reflecting distorted images of her face, hollow and pale, eyes wide with terror, and she realized she could not move backward. The path she had entered had vanished, replaced by an endless labyrinth of roots and shadows, each turn bringing her closer to the tree, closer to becoming one with it. And as she struggled, the whispers transformed into laughter, mocking, seductive, echoing through her mind, suggesting that freedom was an illusion, that curiosity always came at a price. And as dawn approached, the forest seemed to pulse in unison with the bloodwood, a heartbeat that Mara could feel in her chest, in her mind, until her thoughts were not her own, until she no longer remembered the world outside the valley. Only the crimson glow, the endless whispers, and the shadows moving just beyond her vision. And when hikers later stumbled across the clearing, they found only a young botanist's notebook lying open on the ground, pages filled with frantic sketches of the bloodwood, smeared with red sap, but no sign of Mara herself. And the bloodwood stood silently among the twisted roots, its red sap dripping slowly, waiting for the next intruder, brave or foolish enough to seek it. And the locals who passed by could feel the pulse of the tree through the forest, whispering in voices that seemed familiar, warning that curiosity in the Appalachians has a price, that some trees are alive in ways that defy understanding, and that the bloodwood consumes not just flesh, but memory, identity, and soul, preserving them within its sap and shadows for eternity. And long after Mara vanished, anyone who approached the clearing could hear faint whispers calling their name, carrying the scent of damp earth and red sap, a warning, a lure, and a promise that those who dare reach for the bloodwood will never leave, becoming one with the forest, one with the whispers, one with the eternal pulse of the bloodwood. Let's move to our ninth story, a terrifying tale that locals whisper as the echoing asylum, which begins with Daniel, a freelance journalist obsessed with exploring abandoned institutions, who had learned of a forgotten psychiatric asylum deep in the Appalachian backcountry, a place closed for decades under mysterious circumstances after a series of patient disappearances and alleged cruel experiments. And though many in the nearby town warned him to stay away, citing stories of screams echoing through the mountains and shadows that claimed trespassers, Daniel, drawn by the promise of a sensational story, dismissed the warnings as folklore, believing that the asylum's crumbling halls would yield nothing more than dust and memories. And as he approached the rusting gates, he noticed a peculiar stillness in the air, a silence that pressed against him like a physical weight, broken only by the occasional groan of twisted metal in the wind. And he shivered, sensing that the asylum was aware of his presence, as though the building itself exhaled a warning he could not ignore. Yet he pressed on, crossing the threshold into the main hall, where peeling wallpaper and shattered windows bore witness to decades of neglect, and the air smelled of mold, rust, and something indefinably foul, as though the asylum had absorbed the fear of every patient who had suffered within. and Daniel began exploring, flashlight piercing darkness that seemed almost sentient, as if shadows leaned in to observe him, and in one of the wards, he found rows of rusted beds, restraints still clinging to skeletal frames, and on the floor, faded bloodstains traced the echoes of long-forgotten horrors. And as he moved deeper, he began to hear faint whispers, first indistinct, like voices carried on the wind, then gradually forming words, repeating his thoughts, describing his fears, doubts, and regrets. And he realized that the asylum did not merely echo sound, it echoed consciousness, pulling memories, twisting them, making them into threats, and he could not tell if the whispers came from the walls, the floor, or from inside his own mind. And when he ascended the crumbling staircase to the upper floors, the temperature dropped sharply, his breath visible, and the shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the hallway, stretching unnaturally, forming grotesque shapes that would vanish when he tried to focus. And in the old therapy room, he found journals left by the staff, pages filled with experimental notes, drawings of patients with distorted faces, and references to Eshu resonance, cruel method of using sound to manipulate perception and break the mind. And as Daniel read, he realized that the asylum's architecture itself had been designed to trap echoes. Every corridor, stairwell, and room amplifying sound and fear until the mind of anyone inside became prey. And suddenly, the whispering intensified, transforming into shrill cries that overlapped the voices of patients and staff, blending into a horrific cacophony, describing pain, betrayal, and madness. And Daniel tried to escape. But the hallways seemed to stretch, turning back upon themselves, doors opening to the same corridors, windows revealing walls instead of the outside world, and he felt the building, bending reality around him, feeding on his panic, drawing him into a state where the boundary between memory, fear, and reality collapsed. And in one wing, he glimpsed figures at the end of the hall, thin, pale, their faces frozen in expressions of silent terror, some moving in impossible ways, gliding or contorting, as if they had never truly been human. And when he called out, no sound emerged from his mouth, only more echoes repeating his screams, warping them into twisted mockeries of his voice. And every object he touched seemed alive, the rusted bed rails curling slightly under his grip, the floorboards bending like soft flesh, doors breathing as if inhaling and exhaling in rhythm with his heartbeat. And in the central rotunda, he found the asylum's main echo chamber, a circular hall with acoustic panels arranged in strange, geometric patterns, amplifying the sounds of fear itself. And as he stepped inside, he heard the most horrifying realization. The echoes were not only sounds but imprints of consciousness, fragments of minds trapped for decades, and they began to merge with his own, replaying his past, manipulating his thoughts, forcing him to relive every shame, regret, and fear he had ever experienced, until he could no longer distinguish his identity from the chorus of tortured spirits. And when he tried to flee, the exits vanished, replaced by walls that pulsed slightly, alive, almost organic, and the shadows formed a circle around him, thin and skeletal, whispering, singing, mocking, their mouths moving in perfect sync with his own words, as if they were reading his mind aloud. And the more he resisted, the stronger the resonance became, vibrating through his body, shaking his very bones, until he collapsed on the floor, consumed by the building's consciousness, merging with the echoes. And in that state, he could see the asylum not as a structure, but as a living organism, feeding on fear, shaping corridors and rooms around intruders, growing stronger with each mind it trapped. And he realized that the missing patients had not been murdered. They had become one with the asylum, their consciousness woven into its walls and echoes, and he was now part of that network, an observer and victim at once, unable to move, yet aware of all intrusions. And he heard the distant creak of the main gate, the faint footsteps of a new visitor approaching, and the whispers of hundreds of trapped souls swelled to a crescendo, warning, beckoning, mocking, promising that the asylum never let go, and the new arrival would add to its consciousness. As Daniel's own voice now joined the chorus, repeating over and over in perfect synchronization with the building itself. And outside, hikers later reported a chilling phenomenon. Faint screams carried down the valley at night, voices calling names that weren't their own. and anyone who approached the ruins of the asylum felt an oppressive weight. A pull toward the echoing walls, and locals whispered that the building was alive, hungry, and eternal, feeding not on flesh but on mind and memory, preserving souls in the endless resonance of its halls. And Daniel's last entry in his notebook, found in the debris of the main hall, read only one phrase. Smeared in rust-colored stains, the asylum remembers, and it waits. Let's move to our 10th story, known among Appalachian locals as the Hollow Cabin. A story whispered late at night about a small, abandoned cabin hidden deep in the forest, whose legend began with a family that vanished decades ago under mysterious circumstances. And the story follows Eli, a wildlife photographer seeking untouched forest landscapes, who had heard rumors of the cabin from an old guide, a man whose eyes darkened whenever the subject came up, warning that the cabin was not empty, that it held memories, shadows, and a presence that never slept. Yet Eli, driven by curiosity and the desire for an exclusive photo series, dismissed these warnings as superstition and set off with only his camera and backpack, hiking for hours through the dense Appalachian woods, the air thick with moss and the scent of decaying leaves, until he finally stumbled upon the cabin, partially hidden behind gnarled trees. Its wooden walls warped, windows blackened, roof sagging as though it had been crushed under some unseen weight, and as he approached, a chill ran down his spine, the air growing inexplicably cold. And though the forest was alive with birds and rustling leaves earlier, here there was an oppressive silence, the kind that pressed against his eardrums and made every step feel amplified. And Eli hesitated, shaking off the sensation and reminding himself he had faced wildlife alone before. Yet as he reached the cabin door, he noticed strange markings, etched into the wood, lines forming patterns that resembled human faces, twisted in silent screams. And he brushed them off as the handiwork of vandals over the decades, but the moment he pushed open the creaking door, the darkness inside seemed to swallow the light, his flashlight barely piercing the gloom, revealing cobweb-covered furniture, and a fireplace with cold ashes. Yet as he stepped inside, the floorboards groaned in protest, and he felt an almost magnetic pull drawing him deeper, as if the cabin itself wanted him to stay. And he moved cautiously, photographing the interior. But each flash revealed fleeting shadows that seemed to dart just beyond the frame, impossible to capture fully. And then the whispering began, faint at first, indistinct words that seemed to originate from the walls, repeating his name, mimicking the voices of friends and family he hadn't spoken to in years. And the whispers grew louder, forming sentences that revealed his fears and secrets, things he had never spoken aloud, until he realized that the cabin did not just echo sound, it absorbed memories, twisting them into a haunting narrative. And when he reached the back room, he found a small trunk partially buried under debris, the wood etched with the same twisted faces, and opening it revealed personal items that weren't. His butt seemed familiar, photographs of people with hollowed eyes, letters addressed to names he did not know, yet the handwriting felt unsettlingly familiar, as if the cabin had recorded lives and folded them into its walls. And Eli felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But the cabin seemed to shift, corridors and rooms bending subtly, doors appearing where there had been none, until he realized he was no longer in a simple cabin, but in a labyrinthine structure shaped by the presence of all who had entered before, and every step he took was echoed by shadows moving just beyond the light, elongated and unnatural, whispering secrets and memories that were not his own. And as night fell, the forest outside vanished behind thick mist, leaving him trapped in a space where time felt fluid, moments stretching endlessly, shadows dancing along the warped walls, and the air thick with the metallic scent of something unidentifiable, as though the cabin was alive and breathing around him. And as he explored, he found evidence of past intruders, notes scrawled in panic, cameras abandoned, some partially destroyed, but none of the occupants remained, only their impressions left behind, whispers and shadows woven into the cabin itself. And then Eli noticed his own reflection in a cracked mirror, but it moved slightly out of sync with him, eyes hollowing, skin paling, and he realized that the cabin was beginning to claim him, integrating his presence into its memory, his thoughts no longer entirely his own. And as he ran, trying to escape, the corridors folded, doors leading back to the same room, and the whispers escalated into a chorus. A cacophony of voices from every person who had vanished, all urging him to stay, to become part of the cabin's eternal collection, and he stumbled into the main room once more. The trunk, glowing faintly red, pulsing as though alive, the shadows moving toward him, elongated figures stretching impossibly, and Eli understood that leaving was no longer an option, that the cabin consumed those who entered, preserving their consciousness within the walls, and he felt himself merging with the space, mind and body folding into the structure, until his last thought was a fleeting recognition of his own voice, echoing, repeating the cabin's whispers. And when hikers later discovered the area, they found only the abandoned camera, batteries dead, photographs scattered, capturing fleeting images of shadows, distorted faces, warped corridors, and a single frame of a figure standing still in the corner of the main room, indistinct but undeniably human, yet not quite Eli. And the forest around the cabin grew silent once more, the mist thickening, and locals avoided the path leading to the hollow cabin, warning that those who entered often did not leave, and that the building itself was alive, waiting for the next intruder curious enough to explore its dark interior, promising only to consume and eternalize their essence, folding them into the endless whispering memories that lingered within the walls of the hollow cabin. Let's move to our 11th story, known in whispers across the Appalachian region as the Lantern Man of Black Hollow. A story of a creature said to roam the dense forests at the edges of forgotten mining towns. Beginning with Lydia, a folklorist obsessed with cataloging local legends, who had arrived in the mountains after hearing accounts of travelers disappearing near Black Hollow, all reportedly last seen following a strange, flickering light deep in the woods. And though the townspeople warned her that no one who pursued the Lantern Man returned, that it was no mere ghost, but a malevolent force drawn to fear itself, Lydia, driven by curiosity and academic obsession, ignored the warnings, confident that the truth could be found in historical records and careful observation. And she set out at dusk, carrying a lantern of her own and a small notebook. The forest around her thick with ancient trees, whose branches twisted like arthritic fingers, the fading light struggling to pierce the canopy, and immediately a sense of unease settled upon her, a feeling that she was being watched, that the shadows themselves were breathing and shifting. And as she ventured deeper, she noticed a faint orange glow flickering through the underbrush, distant but unmistakable, drawing her forward. And with each step, the temperature seemed to drop, the air growing dense with mist and the scent of decay. And as she neared the source, the whispers began, soft at first, indistinct, like wind through the leaves, but quickly forming words in a dialect she could almost understand, calling her name, recounting her fears, mocking her desire for knowledge. And she realized that the Lantern Man did not merely exist in the forest, it manipulated perception, bending reality around those who sought it, folding the forest in on itself, corridors of trees forming impossible paths that looped endlessly, and every turn brought the flickering light closer, yet always just out of reach, as if teasing her, feeding on her anticipation and dread. And as night fully descended, the glow took on a more human shape, tall and thin, limbs elongated, holding a lantern that burned with unnatural, pulsating flame, its face obscured, hollow, and every shadow it passed seemed to stretch unnaturally, the ground beneath it warping, roots rising like hands to block escape. And Lydia, notebook clutched tightly, could feel the fear in the air thickening, almost physical, pressing against her chest, making each breath a labor. And she realized that the Lantern Man could see into her mind, her memories, her insecurities, whispering them back at her in the forest's language, turning hope into terror until she doubted her own senses, wondering if the trees, the fog, and the earth itself were conspiring against her. And she stumbled upon a clearing where the glow coalesced into a figure, not merely a ghost but a predator born of collective fear, a being whose presence distorted sound and light, making footsteps echo endlessly, causing voices from her past to repeat with mocking variations. And the Lantern Man began to move toward her, gliding silently, its flame-like lantern casting shadows that twisted her perception, showing her images of people she loved in agony, trapped in invisible cages, all pleading for help she could not give. And every attempt to run brought her back to the same spot, the clearing folding into itself like a loop, trees bending impossibly, sky vanishing behind the canopy. Until she understood that time here was fluid, that fear was currency, and the lantern man fed on it, growing stronger with each heartbeat, each tremor of terror, and she tried to confront it, holding her own lantern high, chanting old folk prayers she had researched. But the creature's form wavered, flames flaring brighter, and the shadows around it thickened, forming humanoid shapes of those who had previously vanished, their faces hollow, their bodies distorted, all staring at her with silent accusation, whispering that she would join them if she faltered. And Lydia realized that the lantern man was not one entity, but a collection of all lost in the hollow, a living archive of souls trapped between the living world and the forest, bound by fear and obsession. And as it approached, the lantern flame burned through the fog, illuminating a path that seemed both inviting and fatal, drawing her to the center of the clearing, where the air shimmered unnaturally, and the whispers became deafening, overlapping in a chorus of cries, laughter, and accusations, each voice merging with her own thoughts until she could no longer distinguish herself from them, and she felt her body trembling, limbs heavy, mind fraying, as if the forest itself sought to claim her, to fold her essence into the lantern man's collective consciousness. And in that moment, a memory flashed unbidden, of her childhood, of a fear she had never spoken aloud, and it was as if the creature had plucked it from the depths of her mind, amplifying it until it became real, tangible, pressing against her chest with invisible force, and she screamed, but the sound was swallowed, twisted into the whispers of the forest, repeating back at her in a distorted cadence, until she collapsed, the lantern hovering above her, flame flickering in rhythm with her heartbeat, shadows reaching out to merge with her form, and the forest seemed to breathe as one entity, alive, sentient, feeding on terror. Until Lydia's consciousness began to fracture, memories folding into the forest, herself becoming part of the hollow, part of the lantern man, and outside the clearing, distant hikers later reported hearing strange cries, whispers calling their names, glimpses of flickering orange lights dancing between the trees, and townspeople whispered that the lantern man still roams Black Hollow, invisible, yet present, feeding on anyone foolish enough to chase its light, and that those who vanish do not die, but live eternally within the forest's pulse, their fear becoming part of the creature's being, repeating endlessly, a warning to the curious that in the Appalachian Mountains, some lights are never guides but predators. And the last note Lydia managed to scrawl in her journal, found months later at the edge of the forest, read simply, "Follow the light, and you will never return. The hollow remembers, and it waits." Let's move to our 12th story, whispered among Appalachian hikers as the forgotten mine of Hollow Creek. A story so chilling that locals refused to approach the old mining area after dusk, beginning with Marcus, an urban explorer and documentary, a filmmaker who had heard legends of a long-abandoned silver mine hidden deep in the mountains, where miners disappeared mysteriously in the 1920s, and the few who returned spoke of unseen entities, strange echoes, and tunnels that seemed to shift overnight. And though his friends warned him that the mine was cursed, Marcus, eager to capture unseen footage and perhaps uncover the truth, ignored their cautions, believing these were mere ghost stories meant to keep people away from a dangerous, yet mundane, abandoned site. And as he hiked along a winding trail lined with moss-covered rocks and twisted trees, the sun dipped low, shadows lengthening unnaturally, and a sense of oppressive silence settled over him. The forest strangely devoid of birds or rustling creatures. And when he finally reached the mouth of the mine, a yawning dark hole in the mountainside framed by rotting timbers and rusted equipment, he noticed that the air seemed heavier, vibrating subtly with a low hum that he could feel in his chest, and the faint smell of sulfur and damp earth mixed with something metallic, almost like blood, and Marcus, flashlight in hand, stepped carefully inside, the beam cutting through thick dust and darkness, revealing a network of tunnels supported by decaying wooden beams, and the deeper he went, the more he felt the walls themselves pressing in, as if the mine were alive, breathing, and listening. And soon he began to hear the first echoes, faint tapping and shuffling, like the sound of tools striking rock, but with no source visible, bouncing around the tunnels, disorienting him, and he realized that the tunnels were not static, that Every passage seemed to bend and shift, twisting back on itself, until maps and landmarks became meaningless. And the whispers began, soft at first, like wind through cracks, then forming words, calling his name, recounting his fears and secrets, mocking his hubris for entering. And he understood that the mine was not merely abandoned, it was sentient, a repository of fear and lost souls, absorbing the consciousness of those who dared enter, folding them into its labyrinthine corridors. And as he moved deeper, he stumbled upon personal items scattered across the floor, rusted helmets, broken tools, diaries of miners whose entries grew increasingly deranged, pages filled with references to shadows in the corners, voices echoing from nowhere, and the sensation of being watched constantly. And Marcus felt that invisible eyes were tracking every movement, that the walls themselves whispered his thoughts back at him, twisting reality into paranoia. And when he reached a collapsed section of the mine, the tunnel seemed impossibly long, stretching into darkness with no end in sight. And he caught glimpses of figures in the peripheral vision, tall, thin, barely human, with pale hollow faces, watching silently, vanishing whenever he turned, yet their presence was undeniable, pressing into his mind with overwhelming dread. And he realized that these were the miners who had vanished decades before, their bodies consumed by the mine, their consciousness trapped, folded into the walls as spectral observers, warning him not to linger, yet drawing him further into the dark, feeding on his fear. And Marcus attempted to leave, retracing his steps, only to find that every corridor now led deeper into the mountain, passages he had never seen before, tunnels bending impossibly, creating a disorienting labyrinth. And the air grew colder, dampness condensing on his skin, dripping into his eyes. And each step he took was accompanied by whispers recounting his past, exposing secrets, failures, and regrets, until he could no longer tell where he ended and the mine began. Every heartbeat resonating with the low hum of the mountain itself. And when he stumbled into the largest chamber, he found the source of the malevolent presence, a massive cavern lined with metallic veins pulsating faintly, shimmering with a sickly glow, and within it, shadows moved independently, coalescing into humanoid forms, some with faces frozen in terror, others distorted in impossible contortions. And Marcus understood with horror that these were not merely illusions, they were the minds of the lost miners, trapped, fused with the mountain, feeding and shaping the darkness around them. And as he tried to retreat, the cavern seemed to extend, doors and passages folding into new corridors, and the whispers became deafening, overlapping in a chorus of torment, repeating his every thought, twisting his perception, until he felt himself fragmenting, mind and body merging with the spectral consciousness of the mine. And every attempt to scream or flee only made the whispers louder, forming sentences, mocking him, describing his fear, until he collapsed, vision flickering between shadows and walls that breathed. And in the final moments before losing consciousness, he felt his mind being drawn into the metallic veins, becoming part of the mine's endless network of memories, pain and fear. And outside, hikers later reported seeing a faint glow from the mine's entrance at night, flickering like lanterns, accompanied by muffled whispers carried down the valley, warning any who approached to stay away. And the few who attempted to investigate claimed that the forest around Hollow Creek was unnaturally still, as if the mountain itself had absorbed sound, and locals swore that the mine was alive, eternally consuming those who entered, folding their essence into the tunnels, their memories and fears becoming part of the mountain, a sentient labyrinth that never released its prisoners. And Marcus's last known footage, recovered months later on his abandoned camera, showed long stretches of impossibly warped tunnels, glimpses of pale figures and shadows, metallic veins pulsating faintly. And the final frame captured his own terrified face, eyes hollow, reflected in the metallic walls, before the recording abruptly ended, leaving only silence and the lingering sense that the forgotten mine of Hollow Creek still waits, patient and eternal, for the next intruder, drawn by curiosity, ambition, or foolish bravery, promising nothing but fear, loss, and a permanent place within its dark heart.